Day 2. I will just set the context again. We had a day yesterday where we met. Over the years, it's the 8th year of TechShare Pro, and we're often told that one of the great things about this, but also one of the dangers, is that we're preaching to the choir. The majority of people who come to TechShare Pro probably come because it's called an accessibility event, and people who aren't interested in accessibility don't come. So by definition, we end up talking to the people who are in our gang. So yesterday was an attempt to start reaching out and connecting up with the ad and media industry. I think that worked really well. We had a lot of people in the room we'd never met before talking about the stuff that we do, saying they didn't know what it was, that they'd not come across it particularly before, which is a great sign that we're beginning to connect in with other professionals and networks that we need to be influencing. Today's program fits with that neatly in the sense that what we want to talk about is how we do that more. We're going to be, I've been saying, we're going to step away from WCAG and look at other parts of the world of accessibility, things that are to do with influence in particular. That this space, I think, is for the people who say, well, nobody in my organization listens to me. I don't really have the influence that I want. I don't know how to make change happen faster. I don't know why we're building this stuff and I'm continually having to fix it and make it accessible. So that's obviously something we can all relate to in terms of any organization that we're part of. And today we very much want to bring that to the surface and talk about how you make that happen faster, and also get tips from people. You would just call the OG, Paul. So yeah. For people who've done this for a long time, a few years, particularly to share that knowledge about what works when you're trying to connect with others. And thinking about yesterday, when was the last time you spoke to your marketing team? When was the last time you spoke to your PR or your brand people about accessibility? And listen to them and their perspectives on it and try and take them on the journey. So that was what yesterday is about. I think today is about making sure that we're all checking in with one another, that we've had a good year and that we're just about to get through it, because that's what we always do at TechShare Pro, the community feel and looking after each other. But also maybe pushing into what we're going to do in 2025 about making something happen in your organization, as I say, a bit faster. So I've got an amazing panel. We're going to try and tee that up by talking about the panel's experience of what makes change happen. We all want things to go faster. We want people to be doing things that are accessible from the start. So what in our experience panel can we share that means that we're beginning to think about how we can build that into our work every day? So, Paul, you've been at Barclays 700 years.
Yeah, a long time. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, let me tee this up. So Paul Smyth here. Welcome everyone. Head of Digital Accessibility for Barclays, OG of Digital Accessibility, apparently. And audio description, white middle-aged man in a black shirt. So I think, if this panel is all about how do we make stuff done, get stuff done, how do we make sure accessibility is sustainable, right? I want to kind of really share with you kind of three stories. I know Barclays, we've had a long history of really being serious and committed, leaning into digital accessibility, right, and disability inclusion. We have an ambition to be the most accessible and inclusive FTSE company. And we regularly speak to the likes of Marley, Bex, all the other accessibility leads from the big banks, because there's room here. There's so much work to be done, right? We have to collaborate and compete, right? And there's space to do both. And ultimately, it's disabled customers and colleagues that win. So 3 stories, right? When I think about, many of you are accessibility leaders or in accessibility teams, right? And we have to recognize that there's like 3 phases you go through. There's like that getting started thing, which is all about the business case. And we've talked about that, to death. So we're done with that. Not going to say anything. That next phase is about how do you scale up in an organization, right? And this is about, benchmarking and maturity models. It's about figuring out what are the few things that you can do that have the biggest impact. And I've kind of got the scars to prove it, doing accessibility for like the last 10, 15 years, leading it at Barclays. But, there's a couple of just very practical tips I'd like to share. I think one is really important that if you are lucky enough to have an accessibility team or an accessibility expert, you are not responsible for accessibility at your organization. We see this, that organizations get complacent, and as soon as they hire up an accessibility lead or team, suddenly all the accessibility problems become that team's problems, right? So really important, your job isn't just doing the accessibility work, but it's spreading the accessibility work out, right? And it's spreading out the responsibility for doing that accessibility work. So that's one key point. Another top tip is about don't just focus on the shiny sort of customer-facing systems externally, but how you are supporting colleagues, right? And I'll kind of come back to that and share with you what we do at Barclays. So that's kind of that kind of scaling up. The third stage is that kind of how do we do this in a sustainable way? And we talked yesterday about, bursting the accessibility bubble. It's kind of key that we see accessibility as something more holistic, right? As it's bigger. And we talk in Barclays about we're trying to shift accessibility in 4 ways. So many of you will be familiar with this like shift left thing for accessibility. So we do all of this, right? We mandate accessibility training to all staff at Barclays. We use automated tools. We bake accessibility into design systems and components. We prompt for early engagement with, product owners, designers, diverse disabled users and champions. And all of this stuff is great, proactive accessibility, but it's not enough by itself, right? So we also have to kind of shift right. We have to kind of pay attention to how disabled customers use our existing products and services. So that's about customer services and support. Kudos to Microsoft. They do awesome work here, like their disability answer desk, for example. So think about what you're doing to shift right. Think about how you are shifting up. So how you talk to accessibility, you elevate it, right, with leaders. So we heard some of this yesterday. It's about kind of, the buy-in and budgets. It's about scorecards and successes. There's this sort of pitter-patter to how you talk to senior leaders about this, right, to influence. And then there's also sort of how we shift accessibility down to actually all the, departments of an organisation. So tech, HR, product, premises, procurement, and so forth. Because actually they all have a part to play in this, and it's sort of really important to think about how you are kind of shifting in those directions. So to give you a sort of a glimpse of this, we've been focusing heavily on our colleague agenda over the last 2-3 years. And we need to be kind of data-led and deliberate on what we do in the accessibility space, right, and how we measure the impact we're having. So for Barclays, we've been looking at this for the last few years. We measure sort of, the proportion of our workforce who self-identifies having a disability, mental health, neurodiverse condition. So we've been running at like 10, 11, 12%. But it's not just about counting those folks. We need to kind of look at how engaged and included they feel. And historically, we found they've been far more negative, their experiences, of working in our organisation. And it's, I share that because, that more negative compared to all other colleagues, compared to all other minority groups, D&I. So we need to kind of be really clear about how we close that gap, right? Luckily, I'm the exec sponsor of our Disability ERG. So we survey, we double click on that. We understand what are the barriers disabled folks face. Some of them are about manager attitudes and training. So, okay, HR, fix that. Let's do better training. Some of it is around getting around our buildings and branches. So our premises folks, they've audited all our buildings, globally to kind of really be proactive and fix things. And then some of the digital barriers, right, of using internal systems and workplace tools. So we have kind of audited hundreds of those and worked with external suppliers to uplift them. And if they're not accessible, right, we need to put our money where our mouth is and ditch those that aren't. And that's really key message to sort of tell, right? So by doing all of this work, we're now able to see sort of year on year that we are closing the divide. That kind of negative experience in the past is now far smaller. And that's really key because, I get really annoyed by like accessibility and diversity folks doing like random acts of diversity. We need to actually like measure the impact that we are having to know that we're actually making a meaningful difference. I know it's hard to kind of measure some of this stuff, but it's really important to like tell that story. So again, wrapping up that kind of sustainable, for me, it's about how you're shifting accessibility in all of those directions, how you're getting others to do the work. And that point of like colleagues, how we build the kind of the mechanism, the staircase to rope in the experts, the sort of heads of all of those areas to say, tell me the 1 or 2 things that you are doing to drive accessibility in your department, right? So yeah, that gives you a few sort of practical tips.
Have you taken notes? One of the things you're saying that made me think, because there's a lot there, Paul, and it's really helpful. Because you've done a lot of it, one of the things I've heard is go with the stones that roll. Because presumably at some point you've got to go and work with the people who want to work with you. Otherwise you end up, you've explained the whole shift left and right and up and down. But somewhere in there's somebody who opens the door first and you get to speak to them. Otherwise you're doing your random acts of accessibility. I like that, random acts of diversity. So how do you find that first person to sort of open the door? When you look back now, did it matter who the first person is you work with? Should you be pinpointing someone who you think, if I'd gone to that person first, it would have been a lot easier or quicker or something?
Yeah, I guess we've got to be adaptable, right? I know, Barclays, going back about a decade when we started, we were the first bank to launch ATMs, the first bank to launch talking ATMs. And often it's these like vanity projects that you get like one senior leader that recognises there's, this is good for business, good for society. And it kind of gives you permission to grow, the team and resourcing and so forth. So I think sometimes it's finding those allies to get going, to get permission, to build trust, and then to get more on board the bus. And again, when we have these steering committees where you get the heads and like it gets really competitive, right? Because we're all saying like, okay, well, this is what I'm doing in the HR space or what we're doing in the tech space or design, right? And like success kind of is contagious. So I think it's kind of start with the folks that actually care, the kind of early adopters of accessibility. And then as you grow, make sure that you're kind of promoting that and you're getting more on the bus. Because again, like accessibility is, not optional. We kind of want everyone to get this, but I do get it's hard. And I think the next session is all about accessibility planning and programs, right? It's not just about doing one accessibility project, but several. I mean, a program and how do you sustain this? So there are kind of different challenges as you grow.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Susanna, I think you've only worked in accessibility about 685 years, so leaning heavily on Paul's experience. There was a different angle we had about change. I think one thing we mentioned, because you're heavily involved in the stuff around the EU and the European Accessibility Act, but thinking about what makes change happen and the carrot and the stick, which is a very common refrain for us. What's your take on? Introduce yourself, please, and then and what's your take on the stick? Where does the stick fit into the picture in terms of your experience? Are there waves and spikes as people spot this incoming risk?
Yes, so thank you for that introduction. I'm one of the dinosaurs for sure. And I'm also wearing several hats. So I'm here today representing IAAP EU, which is a member organization a global member organization for accessibility professionals. But my day job is really to lead a research institution in Sweden. And I'm also chairing the standardization organizations that kind of herding the cats on EU standards that are acting as presumed conformance for the EAA. So I do most of what I talk about most these days is actually the upcoming legislation. And it's kind of an irony because I was one of the few persons who said, I don't think we should go the legalistic way in Europe. We've seen what happens in the US, and I think there are better ways to do this. So here we are. I didn't decide that. We have now. This is the third big piece of legislation that we are implementing across the European member states. And yes, it does change. I mean, does the Accessibility Act make change happen? Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the, not only a stick, but I think it's stirring up dust, making people aware. It's kind of putting accessibility higher up on the agenda and so on and so forth. But what we do see and what we have more statistics and resources and results about is what happened with the current legislation that we already have covering the public sector, so the Web Accessibility Directive. And we see that it has really helped in kind of eastern parts of Europe and some countries where accessibility was not really happening before. But we also see that the more mature countries are doing less. So I told you so. So it's making a change, but not always a positive one. I mean, in the bigger scale, I think, yes, legislation will probably do more good than harm, definitely. But it's really sometimes making people take down material that risks to being monitored and risks to being not accessible, not compliant. And it also risks, and we see that very clearly in countries that before said, okay, what can I do to make sure that my content is as accessible as possible? And they really reached much further than the compliance. But now they're saying, okay, exactly what do I have to do to comply to the legislation? So I think our job as accessibility leaders are to make sure that people don't stay there but go beyond. And that will then make even more change. I also think that what IAAP is doing, providing professional certification, is slowly making a little bit of a change. After 10 years as an organization, we are now seeing that more and more procurements and recruitment ads are mentioning that people should somehow prove that they know what accessibility is about, because I think we have all been in the situation where anyone can just say, hey, I'm an accessibility expert without actually knowing anything. And most of the European universities still do not teach UX designers, graphical designers, content managers, developers, blah, blah, blah. Everyone in the kind of web space are not taught, the vast majority is not taught anything or very, very minor things about accessibility. So every generation that we train in STEM courses are getting out there and continue to make inaccessible things so that we can all do audits and remediate. So we are kind of building an eternal but stupid machine that makes us earn money, but it doesn't really help. So I think we really need to, I like the shift everywhere, because if I'm in the middle of that as an accessibility expert, that means that I can go on holiday. Isn't that true, Paul? That's the idea. It's everyone else's problem. But I really think what would make change happen, and that we haven't seen yet in the EU, is to make accessibility knowledge part of the curriculum in all higher education that covers anything digital. I think that is just, that would make the real change in my mind.
So Paul teed up the next session. You just teed up the one after when we hear from Teach Access. Hands up, who's a member of the IAAP? If you could put your hand up. Not bad, eh? So that's what, 2/3 of the room? So I think what may change happen, the professionalization that you're describing, that's relatively recent for those that haven't been involved for all those hundreds of years. The profession is growing more quickly now than it was maybe 5 years ago. It's still only 6,000 members, I think. 7,000 members. So how many accessibility people is it going to take to change the world? Probably a little bit more than 7,000. So the profession needs to grow to be in those rooms and not be accessibility specialists, to be specialists in other disciplines and bringing accessibility into the room via that knowledge. That
Exactly. If I just may, I think what we see when we did the review of the impact of the Web Accessibility Directive for the European Commission, every member state said that the biggest problem is the lack of experts. But I think the biggest problem is the lack of the volumes. The ordinary UX designers, graphical designers, all of that. Not the experts are, you're all very, very important, but we need to have the kind of ordinary teams knowing enough of accessibility so that the expertise is not always needed. So what Paul was talking about, shifting in all directions. I think that would change even more than having more people certified, but happy to certify anyone.
Yeah. Romana, you know almost nothing about accessibility, you told me. Tell me a bit about what you do within the BBC, because I think this does bring this next element, is that it's not going to be accessibility professionals with their very specific technical skills that are only going to make this change happen. Clearly, you arrive with a whole different set of skills. Could you tell us about your perspective on arriving at the BBC?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So, hi, everyone. My name's Romana. I'm from the BBC, and I'm a change lead there, so I'm a change manager by professional. My audio description is I'm a Southeast Asian woman. I've got brown skin and medium-length dark hair. So I agree. I of course, I'm going to be biased in saying this, but I do think that for accessibility to really drive culture change, you need to be thinking about change management type of skills. And I think influencing is key. And I know that not every team's got the luxury of having a change or an engagement professional in their team. But you can still use some of these skills as being an accessibility professional. For me, the key number one thing that everybody needs to do actually is focus upwards. I think as a lot of time as accessibility professionals, we spend a lot of time thinking about champion networks and our peers and working with product teams. But actually, every big change program needs a key sponsor. That's number one, usually, before you even get started on anything. So if you're sitting here and thinking, I don't have strong enough sponsorship to affect change in my organization, I say that's where you start. And it can feel quite intimidating because we don't all have direct lines to people that are really senior. But I would start with the person that created your role, because they obviously saw your role as being valuable. So now say to them, I need you to open certain doors for me in order to be effective. The other thing I would say when I think about how you employ, how you make change happen, I think a lot of time people think, I'll communicate about it and then I'll train people on it and then they're surprised that the change doesn't stick. And actually, that's just the first half of enabling change. So if you've done communications and you train somebody and then it doesn't sustain itself, that's because there's two other critical ingredients that you need. The next is you need to build it into your processes. So it actually has to become habitual, because people naturally don't want to change. I'm a change manager and I will still resist change. It's natural. We want to do what our brain says is automatic. So when you're asking people to not do that, it's very difficult unless you build it into something that is automatic. And then the last bit is reinforcement. So if there's no consequences, positive or negative, to what you do, quickly it will stop happening. So you need to focus on the second half, I think, of sustaining change. And I think that's why sometimes you can start and change and it goes well for a bit and then it sort of dies off. It's because we're not focusing on building it into the practices of that organisation to make it stick.
Thank you. And your experience in the BBC, because it's a vast organisation.
Right.
Is change management a layer in the organisation that was already there? Or, I mean, is it in every team? We sort of see accessibility being something that's almost generic, and I guess change management would be as well.
I just got very lucky that my predecessor recognised that accessibility was not just a technical challenge, it was a cultural challenge. And so he created a team whereby half of the people there had the technical accessibility expertise and the other half were thinking about how we're actually going to affect this change. So I know not every team has that setup, and it's unusual. Mostly you'd have a change professional and those type of skills on a program to affect that change on the program, and then they come back out. You know, it's a real luxury to have a change professional in a business. Yeah. But actually I don't say this too much to put myself out of the job, but what I do is really not rocket science. It's actually just about influencing people. And while that isn't, an easy skill to learn because you just do it by experience, people are probably already doing that in this room. They've just not put a name to it. Yeah. But, my advice would be is you need to take your stakeholder management really seriously and you need a plan for that, because culture change and influencing people doesn't just happen by will and because you hope it does and by turning up to one divisional cascade. You need a real plan to think about who am I going to influence? How am I going to influence them? Why do they care? What am I going to say to them that's going to make them want to do something different? And actually tailor every communication to every group to think about what is it I need you to do differently. The things I say to a procurement manager to say, I need to build accessibility into our baseline requirements for anything coming into the organisation, because I'm quite frankly fed up of my team having to undo the problems that causes, are very different to say as going to speak to our social media leadership group and saying, we're doing all this great work on accessibility. Your one accessible post by accident undoes all that good reputation. So you've got to think about how are our messages different for different groups.
Thank you. And David, slightly bigger organisation, the BBC even. Can you tell us a bit about what this sounds like from the Sony perspective and certainly your experience in terms of seeing that change happen within Sony over the last few years?
Sure. So my name's David Williams. The sixth time we sponsored TechShare, and we're proud to be here again. My background is 25 years of television design. Interesting to Romana say that she's not accessibility expert. I fell into accessibility in 2016. I believe my strength is delivering projects, getting people connected, forming teams with different skills. From Sony perspective, all of our sustainability projects all feature accessibility, environment, D&I, corporate social responsibility with accessibility. So from Sony corporate colleagues, we have an accessibility promotions office we report back into. So really we have a short pathway to get back to senior executives in the board level. Also in Sony Europe, we have sustainability projects. I'm fortunate to get budget and to get, also they help us set up KPIs. So every quarter we report to the Sony Europe president, we report to the CFO what we're doing, why we're doing it, is he getting value for his investment? They also guide us in terms of challenges that we want to face. So it's interesting listening to the fellow panelists' priorities. So from my side, I also highlight the three issues. One is prioritization. You need to have that top-down support. You need to have people that are behind you, people giving you budget, people saying it's the right thing to do. From an organization perspective, our messaging, which goes out to in Europe, we have 10,000 employees across 24 countries. The message is the importance of accessibility within the sustainability agenda. It's being pushed out in webcasts across communications continuously. So the first one is prioritization, getting the senior management buy-in. The second one is people. And obviously we need to have adequate resource. I fully agree with the comments here. We have a lot of accessibility specialists and you guys really passionate about accessibility, but you have to be networked. You have to secure budget. You have to agree delivery, targets. So you need to have the right people. You need to communicate that across your organization, what you're doing and why you're doing it. And last but not least, I hate to say the P word, but process. So big organizations, we hate process. But certainly when we talk about things like the European Accessibility Act, that'll be discussed this afternoon, I've been just looking at that for 3 years and trying to understand exactly what does it mean. I can sit in a room with English-speaking colleagues. I mean, it can take us hours to actually establish what we should do and how we should do it. When you put the multicultural, multinational, multi-language aspect into that, it takes time. So within Sony, we take things like the EAA, and we interpret them into internal documents. So we make a decision, a collective decision of what it looks like for us, how we record the records, how we're going to implement it, because eventually, a country in Europe might challenge us. Our products, obviously Sony operates across products, pictures, music, games. They could challenge us to say, well, prove your websites are compliant, or are your television screen readers really meeting the needs of the EAA? So we need to have evidence. And again, a big organization, you can't rely on one person, a single point of failure. Then you need to spread the knowledge. So accessibility experts need to provide the ground knowledge base, but how it gets reflected through the organization, captured in processes, make sure it's educated, but needs to be accountable and recordable. So that's what I'd say is those 3 points. Prioritization, it's people and it's process.
And from your perspective over those 8 years or so inside Sony, where was the sponsorship thing? You're saying that came from the top down. Is that because Sony had already done that, or you continued to be influencing upwards?
So inside Sony over 30 years, I've been in accessibility.
Oh, I see.
Just since 2016. I'm lucky because through my 25 years in television design, I'm well connected through the organization. Right, and that network really is one of my strengths and my values. I know who to connect to. Right. I know how to secure budget. Yeah. I know how to convince people. I know the pathways, especially when you've got the multicultural aspects and challenges. So maybe I'm lucky in that way, but I need to educate my colleagues, my team members, how to navigate those steps. And again, through the APO, Accessibility Promotions Office in Japan, they really strongly support us to connect back to senior stakeholders.
Sure. Well, I think there's an interesting point there that various rehearsals have gone on around these panels over the last couple of weeks. I think one of the skills in influence is spotting someone who knows what you know.
Yep.
So being in a room with David and in a chat about something, thinking, oh, hang on a minute, he seems to know an awful lot of people. I should probably have a bit of a coffee, have a coffee with you. Say, how would you get this done? I think that sounds like some of what you're doing there is making sure those connections are made. And Romana, you mentioned some of those things when you came into the organisation, and you managed to get the Director General on your first accessibility day. So it's really just opening the door, finding someone who can speak to, not just focusing on the problems that exist within accessibility. I think that's part of that trick of stepping away sometimes. Jennison, thank you for joining us again. Brilliant to see you here yesterday. You're back in today. You're going to tell us a bit about the Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And I'm, as we talked about before, I'm really interested in what you think happens after awareness. So you've had 12 years of global accessibility awareness. It's an incredible runaway success. But in terms of painting a picture of where we got to and what happens next, what's your take on what comes after awareness?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. What I'll do is I'll be leaning not only on that perspective from Global Accessibility Awareness Day, but also to share through my almost 20 years working in the digital accessibility space and what has worked for me over the years to affect change as well. So when you're asking very quickly about Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and I'll invite people to check out the website accessibility.day. For those of you who are unfamiliar, that's the third Thursday of May, and it's all about raising awareness, primarily outside of this bubble that we all live in, to the mainstream tech community. How I want to address the core question here around, how do we affect change is I want to talk about it from what we as accessibility folks, how we need to shift our mindset a little bit in order to affect change. And I'll cover three separate areas. One is, remember, for all of us, just to make sure we don't burn out or get overly frustrated, that accessibility is not an all or nothing situation. Look, we all work in this field. We're all very passionate about wanting to make everything accessible right now, immediately, right? But the reality is, as we all know, and particularly I'm living and working in Silicon Valley as I do, things work at volume and speed. And so we need to be ready to accept that we might not get everything done right away, and that's okay. Merrill Evans coined the term progress over perfection. I've certainly been talking about it as an all or nothing, as just not thinking of it as an all or nothing proposition. But I think it's really important for all of us as we tackle this, so that we don't get overwhelmed and we don't get burned out, And we are able to make the change to think of it that way, that it is not all or nothing. The other thing is we need to meet people where they are. I often hear some of my peers talk about how frustrated they are that they have to keep explaining and re-explaining fundamental accessibility topics. Well, the reality is, and it's been talked about already up here on stage, is that most people aren't taught this in school. And frankly, most people in the main either don't have firsthand experience with disability or are uncomfortable around it, or any of that combination. And so when you go into a room for the first time, understanding where people's perspectives are, reading the room, and kind of trying to understand where they are, and not kind of pounding the table and expecting people to just follow you, is really going to be the way to go. Because you'll have some people in the room who know stuff, and they're going to be your allies. But again, there will be other people there who have other agendas. And of course, you all hear this all the time, that there's competing priorities. And the idea is you may have to trade things off, and that's all right. So think about it that way. Walking into a room, I'm going to have different conversations with my engineers than I'm going to have conversations with my designers and with leaders. So something related to that is this, how we tie accessibility into the conversation. Telling people it's the right thing to do only will go so far. What we really need to do is, as best we can, tie accessibility into the conversation around the mission or vision of the company. And then metrics. And this was also discussed up here before. Tying the metrics, talking about, engagement, how we can increase the engagement on our apps and things as we make things more accessible. Look at our own metrics. What do we have right now? Are customers asking about accessibility? Where are those things? Bring data to the table. For some people, it's not a comfortable place. But part of it is also, these are some of the things that they don't teach in the Accessibility 101. But we also need to grow our knowledge in different areas. We need to get uncomfortable ourselves, learn about the data, to be able, Renata was talking about change management, which is so key to this whole thing. Learn some of those skills as well. And so that makes us more well-rounded folks, and it assists us in being better agents of change.
Thank you. So just, again, straw poll, who has any experience or training in change management? So some, a small number. But I don't know whether you were the same people who put your hands up for the IAAP question. So
but absolutely,
to see where they cross over, won't it?
But yeah, certainly change management, negotiation skills. I mean, I had a life before I came into accessibility, and I was very fortunate that I was able to learn all these other skills that have made it so much easier for me now. And so I always encourage people to consider learning about negotiation skills, project management, real project management, and understanding what that is, and the difference between running a project and running a program, and all those things. So definitely part of it, like I said, is the mindset shift.
So there's a fantastic range of ideas there about how change happens. I'm just going to ask each of you just to reflect on something that you say to your team when they join. So somebody comes in the door and says, "Great, I'm ready. I'm really raring to go." Jennison's talking about making sure we think about progress over perfection. Where should we set the bar in terms of what we should be achieving? Should we be pushing harder than we are at the moment? Should we be doing more than we are at the moment? Or do we just need to keep going at the same speed? How do we make it go faster? And what do you say to people when they join? How do you generate that enthusiasm before the inevitable burnout, some people would say? Bearing in mind, we've got a session about burnout later, not coincidentally, of course, run by Romana Pugh from the BBC, who's seen all that change happen and seen that churn. So we all know there's a risk here. So where do you draw that line? How hard can you push, and how much can you do? I'm going to come back the other way. Jennison, how hard do you think you can go? How fast do you think you
Right.
can go?
So and at the risk of being controversial, I tell people who are hyper passionate about accessibility to slow down. Honestly, like I said, and I really believe it. We're not. Accessibility is the most important thing to us, but it's not the most important thing to everyone else. And as soon as we understand that and accept that and say and know that people aren't going to run at the speed that we want to, I think it's just going to set us up for better success.
Oh. David, how does that sound inside Sony? Faster, slower?
Well, I think from my perspective, any team member has a strength. I think sometimes you talk about having a broad set of skills where everybody almost gets diluted and averaged out. But my belief is somebody who has a strength, you build on a strength. Whether it's a details person, whether it's a communicator, whether it's a controller. So my teams should have people in each position who have those strengths. That'd be my priority. Understand their strengths. And if they operate within their strengths, they should be less stressed because they're comfortable, they're confident. We're not stretching them into areas of project management or schedule control or budget negotiation when they're really the guys who like doing the techie stuff or talking to people. So I'd focus on people's strengths to try to minimize, make them comfortable in what they're doing, and hopefully then using that passion in their strengths, you get the good outcomes.
Thank you. No, great answer.
For me, I think it's a balance between what the business needs you to do. So you've got to go in the direction, but also then saying, what would you like to do? Like, what would be your interest? Because I think you're less likely to have burnout if you're passionate about what you're doing. So if my team say to me, for example, I really don't want to just be doing audits all day, that is not for me, then that is not what they'll be doing. And they'll be like, well, let's create something that gets you out of bed in the morning, because that's important. I think otherwise we can't be completely selfless in what we give all the time. That we'll just become empty or we'll run out of fuel. So I think it's also about what is it you want to do, and we can't always just do that, but trying to create some space to do the thing that actually interests you as well.
Well, thank you.
All the smart things has already been said, but but apart from that, I would start with communication, because in the Nordic countries at least, and I guess it's the same everywhere, there's a lot of, you can't use that word, that terminology is, you can't do that, and it's a lot of red tape around accessibility and disability issues, and we try to train people, but at the same time say, don't be scared of saying the wrong word. It's more your intention and what you do, and then learn gradually to kind of have the perfect language or whatever. But so don't be scared. Just try with, it's where we're learning in the beginning, and just make a try, do the best you can, and trying to encourage that. I think is important. Yeah.
Paul?
I think for me, I love there's an African proverb that's about if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And as we've kind of all said, we need to kind of influence, get more people on that bus. Now, I'll let you into another secret too, as many of you know, that most accessibility roles, as we've all heard, that they're not just one role. They're like 6 or 7 stacked, upon one another, like dressed up in a dodgy trench coat and, bring your own superhero cape. So it's really tough, some of this stuff. And again, Jennison, big fanboy of yours. One of the things you said last night that not many folks would have heard was about, I think, the survey you're doing around professionals and pay. It would be really useful. Do you want to jump in and just remind people?
Oh, sure. Thank you. The Global Accessibility Awareness Day Foundation just launched, what are we now, Tuesday, something called the Global Digital Accessibility Salary Survey to help us all who work in the industry better understand what we are making, what we should be making, and for companies who want to invest in people working in accessibility, how much they should be investing. And so if you go to GAAD.foundation, you can fill out, it's all anonymized. We don't care about what company you work for. Frankly, we care more about, what country you're in, what you're being paid, and we ask some other information related to your job and such. And we'll be releasing all that data next year. So it's the first annual GDAS. We invite everyone here to participate in that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Great. Well, with my timekeeping hat on, we're exactly 1.5 minutes late. So what a brilliant start to the day. I hope you've all enjoyed that very broad perspective about step away from work ag. Think about how we're going to make that change happen. Grow the army of supporters and allies that you need in your organization. And think about that through the day. That's deliberately setting up some of the conversations we're going to have. Loads of the themes already came out, the burnout, the working with other disciplines, the ways in which we connect and influence with others. Those are the things I'm hoping that you'll be able to take away from today as well. So thank you very much. Amazing panel. And I hope you enjoyed that. So thank you.